House come to order if members can take their seats.
This budget is a huge job maker, and the number one solution to economic insecurity is a job.
Hungry children can't learn, and it's our responsibility to try to help.
Equality and opportunity.
I believe most people are here because they want to do some good.
Welcome to Capital Ideas for Friday, March 6th, 2026. Today we've got one of our periodic appearances by Representative Shelley Kloba. Shelley represents the 1st Legislative District, lives in Kenmore, and in addition to being a whiz on all things technological, might be the legislature's most committed advocate for a citizen's right to keep private things private. That's not her only area of expertise, as you'll find out in a few minutes. I'll remind listeners here that Capital Ideas is the official podcast of the Washington State House Democratic Caucus. It's where members of the majority Democrats in the House of Representatives sit down at the Capitol and talk about ideas. We try to make it worth your time, and if this is your first chance to listen, give it 20 minutes. We recorded this in the final week of the 2026 legislative session in Olympia, and it starts right now. Welcome back to Capital Ideas, Representative Shelley Kloba from the fabulous 1st District. I'll let you describe what that district is.
It's the cities of Lake Forest Park, Briar, Kenmore, Woodinville, Bothell, and a tiny slice of Kirkland, and some unincorporated South Snohomish County. So if you think about the top of Lake Washington, kind of on the north end, it's the communities that hug that.
It's a good area.
Lovely.
And this is your 10th year representing the people of the 1st Legislative District. I just want to get that out, that you are a veteran, which leads me to tell you that I think that with the exception of the Speaker of the House, you have been on Capital Ideas more than any other member.
Oh, that can't be right.
I think so. I think that out of 10 years that you've been a member, this may be our 5th
that's probably
Capital Ideas.
Okay. I can remember that. Time flies when you're having fun, though.
It really does. And speaking of fun, we're not having much this session, but I do want to talk to you about what I would consider to be some of the highlights. I'm not sure what you think the highlights would be, and we'll get to that, but I want you to talk about Ryan's Law, which just coincidentally, we're recording this at about noon, and at 1:30, Ryan's Law is going to have a hearing in the Senate. Tell me about Ryan's Law.
This was something that was brought to me by a father. His son's name was Ryan. Ryan was a 42-year-old man, lived here in Washington, taught school in the Shoreline School District, and had been a veteran of the Coast Guard. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer at the age of 42. So immediately, family came up and gathered around, and he was in the hospital for the last 7 weeks of his life. And at the first one, he was, heavily sedated, I'm sure to manage pain. And he was really not lucid. He was not able to connect with the folks who were coming to visit him. And his father knew someone who understood cannabis as a medication and thought that he could come up with something helpful, which he did. But that hospital would not allow Ryan to utilize medical cannabis, even though it is legal in this state and has been since 1998. So his father worked very hard to find a different hospital who would allow that. So for the last 3 weeks of Ryan's life, his pain was managed, his symptoms were managed with a tincture of cannabis, and he was able to be aware and alert, interact with his friends, his family, his loved ones who were coming. His son came to visit him every day after school. They had those moments that if you are a person who's ever had the opportunity to have what you knew was a last conversation with someone, you know how precious those moments are. And so he was able to do that for the last 3 weeks of his life. And it really was something that powered his dad, Jim Bartell, to spend a lot of time and attention to create laws in other states that would allow for that kind of medical opportunity for folks if it's what they choose. And so he worked very hard to advocate and get a law passed in California, and then approached me last summer to see if we could do that here in Washington. And I was absolutely happy to do that.
And this bill looks like it is on a kind of a greased path to end up on the governor's desk.
I certainly hope so. You can't count your chickens before they hatch, but this is a pretty simple bill. It would require hospitals, nursing homes, and hospice care centers to allow a qualified patient with a terminal disease to utilize cannabis within that institution. And there's a lot of guardrails around it. It can't be smoked or vaped. The patient has to have it they procure it themselves. It has to stay locked up. It can't be shared. The hospital personnel do not have to touch it or have anything to do with it. And for transparency and safety, it does have to get documented in the patient's chart. So a lot of good safeguards around it, and it's had a pretty good response. And it's a bill that costs very, very little. So those are good things in a year like this.
And I think when it passed off the House floor, it was with a very, very lopsided vote, something like 90-6 or something along those lines. And so that's why I say it looks like it's got some pretty smooth sailing. We hope that's the case.
Yep, indeed.
That's not the only bill you've sponsored this session, of course. But before we start talking about individual pieces of legislation other than Ryan's Law, I would like for you to give me kind of a 10,000-foot overview of this session. Given that you've been here for 10 years, you've seen sessions high and low, and I just want to know, what's your view with that perspective of the 2026 legislative session?
Well, it certainly is informed by our budgetary considerations, and the revenue that we have previously been able to count on is diminishing. And that's for a variety of reasons. We know what our economic situation in this country looks like. Wall Street is going gangbusters. Meanwhile, folks struggle to afford just the things of daily life. So within that context, we've had to really focus our priorities. And so it is around trying to backfill things that the federal government and through H.R. 1, their big budget bill, took away a lot of services, or the funding for a lot of services that Washingtonians count on. And so one of the things is we're trying to backfill those changes. We are trying to keep our communities safe in terms of the immigration raids that we've seen. I think those are a big concern to a lot of folks in other states and certainly here. I don't think there's anything wrong with going after folks who are here in the country without the proper documentation and who have committed crimes, and through due process, sending them back to where they came from. That would be fine if that's what we saw ICE doing, but that is not what's happening. And the constitutional violations are very disturbing. So we've put in place a few things to make sure that ICE is not gaining access to personal data about people. We're making sure that if there will be a visit to an employer, a place of employment, by some of the folks who investigate those things, that the employer gives notice to the workers that that is going to occur, and make sure that folks can make a decision that is going to be right for them and their families with regard to that. There's things like that that we're doing to try to protect the safety of our families here in Washington. And we're looking hard at, making sure that we are increasing our supply of affordable housing, that we are able to do things that keep food in people's bellies and help people afford health care. So kind of some of the basic aspects of life: food, shelter, health, really trying to focus on those items.
I want to just talk generally about your interest in gaming laws. What got you to have this particular interest? It's not obviously your only focus as a lawmaker, but you have been front and center in many of the laws that have passed in the last decade that had to do with making Washington's legal gaming systems better for the participants, for the communities, and better for people who turn out to have had a problem with gambling. Why gambling, Shelley?
It starts back in my very first year in the legislature when I was put on the committee that dealt with issues around regulated substances and gambling. I can't say that I knew very much about gambling. I had, done a few times. I'd gone to a casino, gone to a horse race, just the casual kinds of things, certainly church bingo here and there. But when I got on that committee, I knew very little about any of those topic areas, and so made it my mission to learn as much as I could. And as I learned more about gambling, the aspect that was really intriguing to me is the impact on human lives. Most people can be a casual gambler like I have been, but for folks that have a problem with it and it becomes a focus of their lives and it becomes a very destructive portion of their lives in terms of taking them away from their families, digging them into a deep financial hole that is very hard to see a way out of. If you physiologically are addicted to a substance, there are some limits as to how much you can consume. For instance, if you think cannabis or you think opioids or what have you. When it comes to gambling, that's a very similar process in your brain of addiction, and it is just about unlimited how much money you can spend, and you can really get yourself into deep trouble in a weekend. And because gambling is still thought of as some sort of vice or voluntary behavior, in contrast to how we look at addiction to substances, which is a treatable brain disease, gambling is also that, but it still bears a huge stigma. And that kind of shame, combined with the kind of financial destruction and seeing no way out, it makes problem gambling, of all the addictions, the one with the highest suicide rate. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's what really sparked me is learning that and thinking about, well, there's ways that we can prevent this while still allowing folks to just recreationally gamble the amount of money that they are comfortable with parting with.
Have you got any bills this year? I apologize, but I haven't memorized your output for the 2026 session.
There is a bill it's not my own, but it is currently in the Rules Committee, and it has to do with sports betting. Currently in Washington, it is legal to gamble on sports on site at a tribal location. It is not legal to do so off-site or on your phone. This bill would allow people to gamble on in-state sport contests. So UW basketball during March Madness, for instance. Currently, that's not the opportunity that people have. And I think there's some good reasons behind that. We worry very much about harassment of athletes. We worry about the integrity in terms of people having potentially access to some insider information about a player's injury, or, I mean, even in this day and age, things like they're all wearing a variety of devices, so like a Fitbit. And when that data is available, one might think, oh, looks like this person did not have a good night's sleep. That might mean they're not at the top of their game. Wow. Every conversation I have, Dan, goes back to consumer data privacy. But at any rate, there are ways, I think, that can spoil the integrity and can potentially harm athletes. So I'm very concerned about allowing this kind of betting on in-state teams. I appreciate that in the bill, they prohibit the prop bets. And so those are betting on events inside of the competition. So like which team is going to win the coin flip, or is this player going to make or miss their second free throw shot, or, you know, any minutia within the game. And it really can get excessive. So it bans those, which is great. That's a very helpful thing. And it adds in some new laws about making it a felony to harass athletes. And I think that's okay, but I don't think it's enough. We're seeing, especially in this day and age when name, image, and likeness is an opportunity that athletes have, and particularly I think with student athletes, the opportunity to make money off of their name, image, and likeness so they can take deals with sponsors and, you know, shoe companies and athletic wear manufacturers or whatever. And those are all great opportunities, but it means that they really do have to have a social media presence and they have to be marketing their brand. And that means that it is nearly impossible to avoid social media. And when people can bet on sports, then they get very invested in if somebody missed a free throw, or somebody intercepted a pass, or threw a pass that was intercepted, or any number of things that could happen inside that are human performance and could either be manipulated so that someone's throwing a game or manipulating the results, We see this at sports contests now, where even like at golf competitions, there are people heckling right there on the golf course and berating the golfer for perceived error. And that is really having a detrimental effect on athletes. And I think it is taking sports into a direction that I think is really not beneficial.
How's that bill looking?
The House version of the bill did not make it out of committee. However, the Senate version is making its way over. It could potentially come to the floor. And I just am not ready to add that kind of additional pressure on our collegiate athletes here in Washington. I think they're already under enough. And I worry about the kind of threats and harassment and verbal abuse that they would be subject to.
Now I want to focus, if you do, on something that you're known the most for here in the legislature. That has to do with privacy. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the People's Privacy Act, which has been a long evolving goal of yours.
For a long time, FBI and a variety of governmental entities have been able to just purchase data that they're interested in instead of having to go through the trouble of due process and getting a warrant or some kind of a judicial instrument, a subpoena or what have you, to have somebody turn over your records. Data brokers are very happy to sell you that information. And with my consumer data privacy efforts, it has been largely to minimize the amount of information that can be gleaned from each and every one of us as we are online. It has been to give us some rights to know what data is being collected about us by an entity, what they do with the data, the right to ask for deletion of that data. And in last year's version of the bill, we also added in something that we're seeing in many, many other states, and that is the right to opt out of the sale of your data, opt out of targeted ads that use your data, and opt out of profiling in service of consequential decisions. And so that's kind of a fancy way of saying that you don't want all the information collected about you into a profile to be used to, for instance, set your insurance rates for cars or deny you a home loan or a job. Any number of these type of important decisions that are made about us with data that we don't even know where it came from and did not really have our permission to collect. One of the things that I've discovered in talking about this type of prohibition, or I guess these opportunities for people to have a little more control over their data, is that when I talk to the Retailers Association, they have told me that loyalty programs, so like at your grocery store, or you think of your miles programs that you might have with a car rental or an airline, any of those type of things that are collecting your data, we all assume that that's kind of an even trade. I'm going to give them my data, they're going to give me a better deal. Okay, that seems fine. Very few of us read any of the fine print, and it's not really facilitated because, you're looking at something online, click here, bada bing, bada boom, you're done. But one of the things that I have learned is, and the Retail Association has been very clear about this, is that those loyalty programs do not work if they cannot sell your data. I find that a little alarming, and I had to have them repeat it to me a couple of times, like, wait, what? That has been pretty clear. And related to that, I had a bill this year that would require data brokers, firms who are selling the data of Washingtonians, whether or not the firm is located here, but the customer is located here, it would require them to register with the state. And kind of the devil is in the details. Many other states have defined data broker as someone who sells third-party data. So that, Dan, is, for instance, you're a company, you collect information about me, you're the first party. If you sell that to somebody who has no customer relationship with me, they would be third party, right? So most states define a data broker as a third party, somebody who collects information about a customer that they do not have a relationship with. Now, in my mind, it makes perfect sense that if you sell my data, you are a data broker. I don't care if you got the information from me directly or that somebody, a company that I'm doing business with has sold my data to you. So for me, my definition was including both first and third party, and that was a huge stumbling block. Then earlier this session, I was able to have an interview on Cairo TV who did a really in-depth look at data with respect to grocery stores. And one of the things that they highlighted was a Consumer Reports investigation that showed that Kroger earns 35% of their revenue from the sale of their customers' data. I know. Dan is over here making a big face you can't see. And that's the reaction I get from people. And I think that was certainly a reaction that folks who watched that interview got. And in my mind, they sound like a data broker to me. And they would be somebody that the industry is fighting to not have included as a data broker. So this is a thorny kind of an issue. And luckily, I'm stubborn. And I am very focused on what's the right thing for consumers. I know who I work for, and it's the people of Washington.
Shelley, we've gone over the time allotted by your legislative assistant for us to be in here. And so I would like at this point to just say anything else, closing thoughts.
Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity. These are topics that are very close to my heart, and I pay a lot of time and attention to trying to get the policies right and always have the people of Washington at the back of my mind with all of the things I work on. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. And I think some of them are somewhat invisible to people. And so I like to bring those ideas forward too.
You've done a great job today. And as I tell you every time you're on this podcast, I really do enjoy talking to you. I think people enjoy hearing what you've got to say. And on behalf of the listeners of Capital Ideas, thank you, Representative Shelley Kloba, for coming by to talk with us here on Capital Ideas.
It's always my pleasure.
That's Representative Shelley Kloba, and that's Capital Ideas for today. I'll point out that a few hours before we posted this episode, Ryan's Law passed its final legislative hurdle, and it's now headed to Governor Bob Ferguson to be signed into law. In closing, if you haven't subscribed to Capital Ideas, now's the time. This is your state government, and what happens here matters far more than you might think, especially in the current state of American affairs. I'm Dan Frizzell for the Washington State House Democrats, putting people first for the past 137 years. Thanks for your time.